Thank you to Susan Chosta for the invitation to join you all here today. I am incredibly honored to be a part of this celebration of the richness and diversity of Nehwar culture, and particularly among such illustrious guests who are also speaking here today. Jigu Nepal Basa Babala Ani Mero Nepali Basa Pani Already Kharab Bayo. So I hope you don't mind if I speak in English today. It's a little bit sejurata, Mero lagi. So most of my colleagues who teach Hinduism and South Asian traditions often focus on India and Hinduism in India. I, however, do my research on Hindu cultures in Nepal. I like to bring the cultures from the margins of South Asia into the conversation. And I'm very pleased to be able to do that in the context of Nepal. My work focuses specifically on the Swasthani Brata, which, as you know, is an important Nehwar tradition that I'm pretty certain that most of you, if not all of you, are quite familiar with. Before I share with you some of my work on this tradition, I do want to tell you a little bit about myself and how I came to be a scholar of Nehwar culture and standing here in front of you today. So my first trip to Nepal was in 1996, when I was in college and went on a study abroad program to Nepal for a semester. As part of that program, we had to do a month-long independent study project. And while searching for a topic for my project, I came across a book in our school library that mentioned Swasthani. And I was very excited about this and immediately intrigued when I began to read a little bit more and realized that this was not just a goddess, but that there was a textual tradition involved and a ritual tradition. And moreover, that they had a special importance for women. And so this intersection of text, practice, and women's experiences and concerns really excited me. So the Swasthani tradition became the focus of that study abroad independent project. And my teachers at the time sent me to Rita Bazaar near Tansen in the Palpo district to spend the month examining women's connections, both mythological and actual, to the Swasthani narratives. And little did I know at that time that I was about to embark on a much longer, much more meaningful journey with Swasthani and the Swasthani Brata than I could have ever imagined at that point in time. So what began as a small study project on a study abroad program as an undergraduate student became the focus of my doctoral research and ultimately my dissertation in graduate school, and is now the subject of the book that I'm writing on the history and development of the Swasthani tradition, which I use as a lens for understanding the formation of Hindu identity and culture in Nepal. Now, since that first trip, I've returned to Nepal several times for both longer and shorter stays, and have lived there for about a total of 4 years, not all at once, but on and off. And over that time, I studied Nepali with various teachers in Nepal and in the US. And eventually, when working on my dissertation research in graduate school, I studied classical Nepal Basa with Dwala Stabli Tuladar in Kathmandu, who was an amazing, amazing guru. And my proficiency in classical Nepal Basa has always exceeded my spoken Nepal Basa. So again, I appreciate you in humoring my as yet evolving skills. I consider Nepal my second home. And I really look forward to the day when I can take my husband, who has been to Nepal with me before, but also my small children, ages 3 and 5, to Nepal with me to share with them this part of my life and the work that I do there. So, in short, that's how I came to study the Swasthani tradition and Nehwar culture. And what I want to share with you today are some of the discoveries about the history and development of this important tradition. Despite the popularity of the Swasthani Brata in Nepal, little is known about its origins and its histories. And virtually nothing is known about it outside of Nepal and outside of Nepali and particularly Nehwar communities. So it has largely escaped the eye of scholars, which constantly surprises me, because the Swasthani Brata has an unbroken history from the 16th century to the present day. And it's well documented. This history is well documented in thousands of manuscripts preserved in the Rasya Abelakalaya, in Asasafaguti, in private collections, and of course through individual copies owned and still read in Nepal today. So this affords us an incredible opportunity to examine the making and, more importantly, the maintaining of a living religious tradition. The survival of a given text is not guaranteed, particularly in light of social and political changes, non-literate cultures, and harsh climates, for example, all of which are challenges that have faced Nepal over the last 500 years. In fact, it's much more likely that a textual tradition will fade away or just remain in the realm of the pundits and the priests, as is the case with, for example, the Nepal Mahatmya or the Swayambhu Purana, which are two important local traditions, but they are not read regularly, and nor are they read by the masses, right? So I pose these two questions today. Oh, I'm not even paying attention to my slides. Can you go back? Go back. Go back. Okay, these are my two questions. Yes. How and why has the Swasthani Brata, the Swasthani Brata, survived from the late 1500s CE, or the late 600s in Nepal Sambat, to today? So to work towards an answer to these questions, I'd like to offer you a brief historical sketch of the Swasthani Brata tradition. And this is based on my examination of approximately 125 Sanskrit, Nepal Bhasa, and Nepali language manuscripts, drawn from over 700 manuscripts in the National Archives, and also from nearly 24 private copies owned by locals in Sangku, who were generous enough to allow me to photograph and read their copies of the text while I was living in Sangku. Sangku, as I'm sure you all know, is a village located about 18 kilometers to the east of Kathmandu, and is the host of an annual public month-long observance of the Swasthani Brata that draws hundreds of Bratalu participants and thousands of visitors. Next slide, please. So I've observed the ritual observance in Sangku, I think 5 times since 1999, until just this past year was the last time I've seen it, most recently. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank my friend and assistant in Sangku, Prabin Raj Sakwa, who is here visiting the US for the first time, and who will be speaking about the really wonderful festivals of Sangku in just a minute. But Prabin Dai and his wife Serena and his children have been very generous in opening their home and their family to me and welcoming me as a member of it. And I also thank, although not here today, Prakashman Strasta Sakwa, who has similarly been so generous with his time and his knowledge of local history in Sangku and the traditions and cultures. And really, I'm indebted to all of Sangku, who have just been very welcoming and endless in their contributions to helping me achieve the kind of success that I've sought in my own work. Okay, now the Swasthani. The goddess Swasthani, Swasthani Devi, Swasthani Mata, and the Swasthani Brata Kitab are at their core a Newar tradition. Next slide, please. All evidence indicates that they originated among the Newars in the Kathmandu Valley, in Nepal Mandala, right, home of the Newars. In nearly all of the early manuscripts, when an author's name is mentioned, which is admittedly, unfortunately, rather rare, the names are Rajabadai, Rajabacharya, and their site, their location as being in Lalitpur, or Kathmandu, Bhaktapur, Sangku, and so on. So the Newar origin of the tradition is also evident in several of the names for the main characters, which are clearly Newar. For example, Gomayadu, right? A distinctly Newar name with the Ju on the end, which is shortened by Bowens and Chetris to simply Goma in the Nepali versions of the text. And most importantly, the text itself, for the bulk of its tradition, and particularly the first 200 years, was transmitted almost exclusively in the Nepal Bahasa language. Right? But at the same time, while I firmly believe and argue that it is a Newar tradition, it also has become very much a beloved tradition among the Bauans and Tuftis and outside of the valley. The tradition has traveled far and wide, but yet because it grew out of the Newar culture and practice in Nepal Mandala, it is still most deeply rooted there among the Newars. Next slide, please. So the oldest extant copy of the Swasthani dates to 1573, or Nepal Samvat 693. It's written in Sanskrit, although this is a very highly Newarized Sanskrit. It's very corrupt and clearly shows the influence of someone who is more proficient in Newar, Nepal Bahasa, than in Sanskrit. And the main story of the Swasthani, given in this manuscript, is recounted only in 8 folios, or 8 pages. It's very short. And it told of a local legend of hardship and devotion. For those of you who might be less familiar with the Swasthani, or those of you who just want a refresher, let me just offer this very simplified skeletal outline of the narrative. So an old Brahmin couple miraculously begets a young daughter. This daughter, Gomayatu, marries an ill-fated, very aged and decrepit old man. And he dies in a foreign region while begging alms to support his wife and soon-to-be-born son. Years later, when her son Navaraj is grown and married, he sets off in search of his father, leaving his mother and young wife behind. The mother and wife, Chandrawati, who is characterized as selfish and ungrateful, both eventually perform the Swasthani ritual vow, Swasthani Brata, and these circumstances, they perform them under very different circumstances. Gomayatu is very pious, Chandrawati not so much. And these critical performances of the ritual vow result in the reunion of mother and wife with their son, husband, as well as a positive change in their social status for all 3. And of course, they live happily ever after. Now, the Swasthani texts in the 16th and early 17th century present this popular narrative of triumph over continued and often unjust suffering without significant change during this time period, and usually within the span of less than 40 handwritten pages. Next slide, please. So initially the story was very short, it was very simple, and just the Gomayatu, Navaraj, and Chandrawati narrative. By the mid-18th century, however, next slide, please, the Swasthani began to exhibit a significant narrative development that expanded the text to over 100 folios, and eventually to several hundred folios. In addition to small modifications of the original and foundational narratives of Gomayatu, Navaraj, and Chandrawati, this narrative expansion was a result of the incorporation of an altogether new series of stories into the Swasthani Brata. That is, for the first time in its now nearly 200-year-old history, the Swasthani's local narratives that I've just described no longer constituted the sole or arguably even the primary narrative of the text. From this period forward, the text opens with the well-known narrative cycle from the Sanskrit Puranas that focus on Mahadev, his relationships with Sati Devi and Parvati, his 2 wives, the birth of his children, his battle with a number of demons, and his general role in both the disruption and reestablishment of order in the cosmic realm. Now, the Swasthani has always asserted a connection to the Sanskrit Puranas. Right? The end of each chapter and the end of the book itself states as much. And I'm sure many of you know this by heart. Next slide, please. Iti Sri Skanda Purane Keda Karne Mag Mahatme Sri Sri Swasthani Brata Katha Samaptam. Right? There is, however, despite what the text says, no evidence that the Swasthani Brahman belongs to or was ever, in fact, extracted from the Puranas. If you look at any of these Purana texts, which I have very closely, there is no Swasthani Brata Katha found within them. But beginning in the mid-18th century, or early 18th century, the Swasthani begins to transform under the process of Puranicization. Next slide, please. very cumbersome word, by which I mean that the Swasthani backbone gradually evolves from a small local Vrata into an authoritative Purana text, right? The Puranas, these encyclopedic bodies of literature, these Sanskrit texts that are a source of almost anything you could want to know about Hindu practice, belief, myth, pilgrimage, the gods, genealogies, and so on and so forth. And these really, as many of you probably know, these Puranas are really the foundation for modern devotional Hinduism, right? So the Swasthani Brata begins this process where it evolves from being a small local Vrata into an authoritative Purana text, a popular modern tradition that was local in origin, but now increasingly pan-Hindu in nature. And while I don't have time to go into the details at present, in my larger project, I argue that this gradual transformation of the Swasthani Brata into a local Purana was tied to the ongoing process of Hinduization of the Newars in the Nepal Valley. And some might even call this the Parvatization. That's a real cumbersome word, right? The influence of the Parvats, the hill Hindus. But I argue that the Swasthani both reflects this process and ultimately was a tool for the process of Hinduization. But now, the introduction of the whole Mahadev, Daksha Prajapati, Stati Devi, Parvati narrative cycle in the mid-18th century is in fact the first of 3 phases or stages of narrative integration and narrative development that took place at particular moments, building upon each other in the 18th and 19th century. Next slide, please. So the first stage that I've just described focused on weaving the Swasthani narrative itself into Puranic narratives and vice versa. And it did this most notably by having Parvati perform the Swasthani Brata in order to win Mahadev as her husband, or in order to bring Kumara back home after he began his long circumambulation of Mount Kailash. Interestingly, after the initial inclusion of these narratives in the 18th century, these Purana narratives gradually grew in size and number such that in today's contemporary Nepali language Swasthani books, the Purana narratives constitute nearly 2/3 of the text, consigning the kind of the original foundational narratives of Goma, Navaraj, and Chandravati to simply the last third of the text. Now, the second stage focused on establishing a larger narrative that laid out universal conceptions of the Hindu worldview and effectively tied the Swasthani into different Hindu devotional paths. It occurred close to the end of the 18th century with the introduction of a second familiar Purana narrative, that of the 2 demons named Madhu and Kaitaba, and their involvement in the creation of the universe. In the Swasthani, this creation narrative precedes the narrative cycle centered around Mahadev that was infused during the first phase of Puranic narrative integration. And this newly introduced creation narrative, which in a 1783 text was told in a single sentence, right, just a single sentence in the very beginning, this quickly expands in later Swasthani texts to become the first of a series of detailed creation narratives that describe the creation of the universe, heavens, hells, earths, oceans, islands, animals, and other living creatures, the gods, goddesses, and humans. There are also extensive related discussions pertaining to this Puranic geography and time, as well as the lineages of Manu. As with the first stage of Puranic integration, the inclusion of this key creation narrative in the Swasthani indicated another notable shift in the text evolution. The fact that the chosen narrative is the Madhu Kaitaba creation story is of particular interest, most importantly because it is notably a Vishnu-oriented narrative. The inclusion of this narrative that emphasizes his presence and power is conspicuous because of the otherwise increasing focus on Mahadev in the text. After the first phase of Puranic integration, Mahadev comes to figure prominently throughout the Swasthani, and eventually all but overshadows Swasthani as the patron deity of the text. Mahadev is much more present than Swasthani is, at least physically. So significant here then is both the subordination of a local goddess to not just one but 2 popular pan-Hindu gods, and the competing influences of followers of Mahadev and Vishnu in the text. Now the third stage focuses on the traditional roles and notions of the feminine assigned to Hindu women, both in the text and the ritual vow that's undertaken by women and men each year, and also in the lived and imagined realities of Hindu women and men more broadly. This third phase of the Purana integration begins in the early 19th century, but it really gathers momentum in the late 19th century and early 20th centuries. And whereas the first two stages of development occur more or less uniformly across a predominantly Nepal Lhasa textual tradition, this third stage comprises two parallel concurrent developments that differentially transform Nepal Lhasa Swasthani text and Nepali language Swasthani text in terms of their narrative content. By this I mean there are now, as of the early 19th century, Nepali language versions of the text. So for the first time, the Newar language Swasthani Brata is translated into Nepali language in the early 19th century, around 1810. And since that point, it also began to be reproduced largely in Nepali, or at least at a similar rate as it was in Nepal Lhasa. So I'll have something more to say in a minute about the emergence of these two different language variant traditions, one in Nepal Lhasa and one in Nepali language in just a moment. But in this final stage of narrative expansion, next slide please, the Nepali language Swasthanis incorporate a third set of popular Purana narratives in the 19th century. And these include the episode of Mahadev with the Rishi wives, the burning of Kamadev and his wife Rati's subsequent fate, and the story of Vrinda, the wife of Jalandhar. However, this third series of Purana narratives does not occur in the Nepal Lhasa text until the 20th century, nearly a century later. Meanwhile, the Nepal Lhasa texts in the 19th century experienced a different kind of expansion, with the incorporation of a selection of other narratives that yet further augment and enhance Gomayas and Gomayanju's and Chandravatis and Navaraja's stories. And these include the stories of Dharmaketi Raja, Dhamma Lakshmi Samvade, Nala Dhammayanti, Srivaratri, and even the Ramayana in some cases. And I have yet to find any of these stories that I've just listed in any Nepali language Swasthani text. So now let me briefly just say something about the Nepal Lhasa and Nepali language divide within the Swasthani tradition. As I've already said, the Swasthani Brata was transmitted almost exclusively in Newar, in Nepal Lhasa, for the first 200 years or so of the tradition, from the late 16th century to the early 19th century. The Nepal Lhasa texts, while they all shared the core narratives, nevertheless demonstrated a marked degree of heterogeneity. Right? There are bigger versions and there are smaller versions. Next slide. And you can see here two residents of Sangpu who have considerably different sized Swasthani texts. One that is 300 and some folios and another that's only 65 folios, right? And these differences cannot be accounted for simply by the size of the handwriting, right? This is about differences in the amount of detail presented in different Nepal Lhasa texts and in the inclusion of these other secondary narratives, some or all of which may have been included. Now, in contrast to this, once the text is translated into Nepali in the early 19th century, Nepali language Swasthani kathas are immediately standardized. They first follow a 22-chapter model for a number of years, and then quickly switch to the 31-chapter model that many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with. And there is little to no deviation from these two models once they occur. So whereas the Nepal Lhasa Swasthani Brahmans are very heterogeneous and show a lot of variety, the Nepali language Swasthanis are very, very standardized. But it would be misleading to talk about or think of these as two distinct traditions of the Swasthani. Rather, they are two different articulations of the same narrative and tradition. And many Newars grew up reading the Nepali language variant as well, right? So they're not two entirely different traditions with entirely different stories, but there is a degree of difference nonetheless between them. So now let me return to the two questions that I posed at the beginning of my talk. How and why has the Swasthani Brata been able to survive from the late 16th century to the present? I've explained the how, right? The Swasthani Brata has over the years incorporated different narrative elements, mostly from the Puranas, into its narrative fold, right? The why answer of why the Swasthani has been able to do this is a little bit more complicated. If we go back and consider the timing of the various narrative developments that I've just outlined, we'll find that they roughly correspond to major political and social developments in Nepal and India, such as the Gorkha conquest of the Nepal Valley. Over the past 500 years, and particularly within the last 300 years since Prithvi Narayan Shah, Nepal's understanding of itself and its sacred significance for the region has slowly expanded. That is, in the early Malla period, Nepal was characterized by a rather insular focus on Nepal, on sacred sites such as Pashupatinath and then on the Nepal Mandala. Towards the end of the Malla period, this focus gradually broadened to understanding Nepal as a sacred center within the greater Himalaya, right? And this is evidence in the development of Nepal's other local Purana traditions, such as the Pashupati Purana, the Nepala Mahatmya, and the Himavad Khanda. Next slide, please. The Pashupati Purana, which celebrates the sacred site of Pashupatinath, eventually expanded into the Nepala Mahatmya, which glorifies Nepal Mandala, right? The Nepal Mahatmya itself then eventually expanded into the Himavad Khanda, which was no longer a standalone Purana text, right, or a standalone Mahatmya text, but a part, a Khanda, of the Skanda Purana that situated the sacred region of Nepal within the larger sacred region of the Himalayas. These developments occurred in response to the increasing political, economic, and cultural interaction between the neighbors of the valley and people from the western Himalayan hills and the Indian plains that gradually altered the frame of reference for Newar and Nepali religious and geocultural identification. In the same way, the Swasthani began as a local katha, but gradually transformed into a Purana text that fulfilled its long-held claim to belonging to the Pan-Hindu Sanskrit Purana tradition. And in broader terms, the incorporation of the Purana narratives provided a new literary and cosmological framework for the original narratives. Prior to the first Puranic infusion in the 18th century, the Swasthani was grounded primarily in the mortal realm, the human realm, focused on the human local condition. The incorporation of Purana narratives expanded the cosmological horizon of the text to include the realm of the gods and goddesses and contextualize the lived human experience within a divine mythological history. This served as a reminder and reassurance to the Swasthani's audience of the social and moral order that structured their universe, especially in light of the political and social upheaval that Nepal had experienced over the years. The text was written into a larger history that situated the local characters and customs within a broader context, one that highlighted the local nature of the original foundational narratives while bringing this local aspect into conversation with translocal regional figures and ideology.
Excuse me, just 1 second. Ana lune tonaji pi bhajme pi thana disturb juya chongodu chikpinta sumka gyani juya chai weka yo notu nona tita je hina pena chona. Please go ahead. Thank you.
So similarly, as I just said, the text was written into a larger history that situated the local characters and customs within a broader context, and one highlighting the local aspect of the original narratives by bringing those into conversation with this larger translocal regional figures and ideology. And similarly, with the incorporation of the Mandukaitaba episode in the Swasthani, the text literally takes the readers back to the very beginning, right? Back to the very beginning of time and creation. And it sets up a larger narrative within which the text that begins with the universal conceptions of the Hindu worldview and Hindu ideas and beliefs, and lays the foundation for the subsequent focus on the gods and goddesses within the divine realm, which in turn offers background for the following local narrative situated in the human realm. the Swasthani transformed from a local legend into a Purana text that became an important resource that articulated and reinforced the local worldview and experience of Hindus in a modernizing Nepal. So by way of conclusion, I want to suggest that the Swasthani Brata is an archive. It's a repository for more than just the fun, the Ramayana stories of gods and goddesses and the humans who interact with them. Right? Within the pages of the Swasthani, the rich diversity of Newar, and eventually also the Nepali, more broadly speaking, of Newar culture, history, language, belief, and practice is preserved. And I'm saddened and worried at times, I'll admit, that when I see many of the older handwritten Swasthani texts no longer read because fewer and fewer people are able to read them. Next slide, please. So here we have an older text that's brought out, and these become sacred objects, and they're worshipped, but they're not read anymore. Right? We can see wrapped. This is in Pravin's family. The old text is brought out and worshipped, but they actually read from a newer Nepali language printed text from the bazaar. And this is a wonderful. The oldest on the left is the oldest Swasthani Bahan that I found in Sangku that dates to 1764. That was hidden under someone's bed. So I get sad when I think about the possibility of these texts being silenced and becoming silent, because if they do, I worry that a part of Swasthani's history and culture, and so a part of Newar history and culture, will also become silenced. But I'm nevertheless optimistic. I'm not going to leave you on a low note. I am optimistic that the Swasthani tradition has a long and healthy life ahead of it. It has already demonstrated its ability to transform and adapt to local conditions and concerns amid the shifting political, social, and religious landscape of Nepal over the last 500 years. The Swasthani tradition is exceptionally resilient, and it will continue to be embraced by the people who celebrate it. It continues to have meaning, and I think that's being rejuvenated again and again every year. And this might, in fact, be best illustrated by the availability of an iPhone app for the Swasthani. Next slide, please. So I leave you with that hope. It is in the Nepali language, but nonetheless, for those who are not in Nepal or for whatever reason have greater access to an iPhone than an actual text, there is the hope that the Swasthani will carry on through different mediums and among different communities into the future. So, Hanon, Jojolapa, and Yoko Shuda.
Yoko Suba to Maljuji.